Welcome everyone to the Disability is Diversity Book Club, specifically for the case studies book. I'm going to include in the chat the link to register for the book club and find out information about future sessions. All right, so today we are doing the third case in the book, which is the student with a sensory disability. We want to thank the authors and recognize them for this particular chapter, which is Dr. Michael Argenyi, who's here with us today, Alicia Booth, who's also here with us today, and Christine Lowe from Mount Sinai School of Medicine. All right, and so now I'll turn it over to the moderators to introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Argenyi.
Hi everyone, thank you for being here today. So I'm a physician now, specialist in addiction medicine at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics.
Hi everyone, my name is Alicia Booth and I'm a nationally certified interpreter, have worked as a designated medical interpreter for over 10 years. And the founder of Designated Interpreting, and I'm very happy to be here and participate in this conversation.
Thanks. And I'm Grace Clifford, and I'm currently the Director for Disability Services for the Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. I'm also part of some of the Docs With Disabilities Initiatives, including the DRP Academy. And just as a note, as Dr. Argenyi is currently working, he might be called away at any time, in which case Alicia and I will fill in for him. So we want to start by thanking all the contributing authors to this book, which there are many, and two of them are with us today. You know, without them, this would not be possible. So we thank them for their time and contribution to this book. For today, if you would like to engage in the discussion, we'll have some distinct times where we ask for feedback and kind of contributions regarding the case study and working through the case studies. There's a couple different options to participate. One, you can put questions in the Q&A or comments in the Q&A, and Alicia will monitor that and read that aloud. If you want to do that anonymously, you have that option. The other option is you'll be able to raise your hand, and I'll be monitoring for that during those sections. And I will unmute you and let you know that you can, share aloud your comments, questions, or reflections. So just some reminders as we get started. We like to remind everyone this is a space for learning and connecting. So no one has all the answers, including the facilitators here with you today. So questions are truly welcome or reflections at all levels. We ask that individuals be mindful of contribution time just to ensure opportunities for everyone to participate today and to share and connect. This is not a space, unfortunately, for individual or group consultation regarding specific student cases. And we ask that individuals remember to navigate this space with humility and respect. Perfect. And for the agenda today, to give you an idea of how the flow of it will work, we'll start with some key points of the case history for those of you that need a reminder or refresher about case 3 from this book. We'll go over the perspectives, starting with the student, then talking about the medical school's perspective, the disability resource provider's perspective, and then the designated interpreter's perspective. Then there's some guided questions where we'll want you to engage and give us your reflections and kind of thoughts on how you would approach the case or the student situation. And then we'll have hopefully time at the end as well for open questions related to supporting a student in this environment or things we talked about throughout the case. All right, and with that, I will turn it over to Alicia. You are currently muted.
Unmute there. So as Grace said, this is case 3 in the case book. And this was an honor to be part of the conversation around writing this and having dialogue with Dr. Argenyi about this. This is very near and dear to our hearts. So we really want to encourage people to participate and bring creative thoughts. No, there's no wrong or right answers to this. It's a creative process. So it's a very open and safe space, as Grace shared. So just to review the case history here a little bit, we have Conrad, who is a hard of hearing student. He's entering the clinical 3rd and 4th years portions of his medical school. He has benefited from CART and ASL interpreters during his college and his second year of medical school. Conrad is also an adult learner who is very proactive and knowledgeable about his accommodation needs and has identified either with other deaf and hard of hearing physicians, trainees, and associations as potential resources. We're going to actually share some of those resources later on in this case discussion. He has already successfully passed his first 2 year of medical school and has worked in an outpatient clinic. And he has identified that ASL interpreters are more adaptable for his clinical practice. And I want everyone to think about that word adaptable as we start to integrate the conversation around interpreters and why my adaptability might be important for this type of clinical environment. Some of his experiences with community ASL interpreters were unsatisfactory given their vocabulary, given the vocabulary and navigating a clinical room, and he has had concerns about their performance in a busy hospital. Conrad is interested in exploring the designated interpreter model. Conrad also has a cochlear implant with some improvement in word recognition scores. He has speech reading skills and intelligible speech. This is the school's first experience in matriculating a deaf student, and the student has met with the medical school's technical standards committee to discuss evolving accommodation needs for the clinical space. The technical standards committee has offered to waive the surgical rotation. Again, another thing to be thinking about the consideration of waiving a rotation in this process. And I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Argenyi at this point to talk about the perspective of the student.
Thank you. So this is obviously something as a person who has hearing loss that I have some lived experience with, not necessarily the exact thing that have come up in this case, but certainly the challenges of navigating clinical environment with hearing loss. So these may not be exhaustive of all of the ideas and experiences of deaf and hard of hearing people at the spectrum, given our large range of language abilities and hearing abilities and preferences as well for how one navigates a world. So, but one of the things that had come up is, there is a sense in this case about a lack of disability support, i.e. somebody, when Conrad is going to the technical standard committee, they don't necessarily understand and know what might be feasible or possible for a disability, from a disability perspective for navigating clinical spaces. And there's also, of course, for us with hearing loss, masks, as you may know from the last few years in particular, are challenging, and the surgical OR has a requirement to wear masks, and this reduces our ability to speech read and to also receive nonverbal cues. In the surgical rotation in particular, there is a need to be able to have your eyes on what's going on, to be able to identify anatomy, to look at what's being done during the surgical procedure, and for people who rely on their eyes for communication. There's the constant need to select where our eyes are going to be placed. Is that going to be on the person providing communication, whatever that mode might be, or on the site where something is happening? Medical terminology is also rife with specialized vocabulary that often sound very similar, and especially for people with hearing loss and varied speech discrimination skills, certain words can sound very similar, but are actually very different. In my experience, urology and neurology also look very similar on the lips, and I do and have mixed them up. There's also this process of going through the accommodation request process. There's this idea of well, if I have accommodations in place and or if I go through the process of waiving a rotation, does that mean that I am being marginalized or being othered because of my hearing loss? And at the same time, students do recognize that there may be unique challenges in certain environments that may make those experiences uncomfortable and force them out of their comfort zone, and they may understand why the school is offering the possibility of waiving that experience. But then how does that also reflect on to their classmates and to residency programs when they send in their applications and see that those experiences have been eschewed? There's also in the case when he's being offered the opportunity to waive the experience, this implicit lack of encouragement and appropriate career counseling. He's basically being given the message that surgery is out of reach for him. Next slide. And overall, thinking about the accommodation for him as well, and some of his potential thoughts about how an interpreter may or may not provide ideal access for him. I think that he may be concerned about the lost opportunities for networking among his peers and with professionals, and those are important when he needs to consider getting letters of recommendation for residency application and trying to just gain more skills and leadership position, for example, that may contribute to his application. And of course, anytime somebody vocally asks for an accommodation or said that one has been not working for him, brings in the opportunity for retaliation from a school, even in the situation of having a good working relationship up to that point.
Thank you. So now we transition to the perspective of the medical school in this case. So one, they're certainly thinking about legal compliance. So the concern about whether, the medical school is maintaining compliance, especially with, HIPAA, when it comes to CART and captionists and interpreters in the clinical space, and having access to these pieces. They're worried about patient privacy and concerns that patients will report loss of privacy during clinical encounters because of the need for interpreters or CART providers in the space, and the idea of non-clinical staff being present. And the question of, the integrity of the technical standards. So the question of whether the student is unable to meet the standards of the program by requiring these accommodations, and does this constitute a fundamental alteration, or is this a reasonable accommodation? They're worried about the idea as well of the undifferentiated medical school program. So there's always this, or commonly this conflict between the desire for all students to become undifferentiated graduates, meaning they're not specializing in a particular area, so you're not waiving certain requirements, but also this concern about if they go the opposite direction to create some inclusion from their perspective, are they limiting the professional opportunities for the students? They're worried about in, the operating room, the specific concerns that will come up there. So concern for patient safety related to potential delays, with the relay between the student and the captioner or the interpreter, as well as, adding additional kind of individuals or bodies to a very small space that requires maintaining sterility. And then there's the integration of the learner with disability into healthcare settings. So how will they handle or navigate, educating the clinical staff and site directors, for the students, and how do they, reach everyone? And is it really feasible to reach everyone and to address potential bias, based on the student's disability, and the worry about the experience for the student in these settings because of the unfamiliarity of working with a student with these types of needs. The other piece in this case is there's a lack of disability services experience or expertise. So because the medical school is somewhat isolated from main campus's disability services representatives, and this is a novel, first time situation of supporting and matriculating a student with hearing loss in this setting or into clinical settings. There's a lot of unfamiliarity with creative and innovative methods for mastering, competencies and navigating these spaces. How do they access overhead telephone and in-person information in these diverse healthcare settings, and kind of, how do they look ahead and help the student look ahead for what potentially might be a barrier for this student without someone who has that expertise and experience. And then there's the concern about the ability to function in a fast-paced clinical environment. So, if there is this delay time between the student and the interpreter or the CART provider, how are they going to navigate those time-sensitive, training experiences and clerkships such as OBGYN or emergency medicine? Then I'll turn it over to Alicia.
Thank you. So I do see a question coming in, and thank you for that question, Kelly. We're going to address, that's going to be, I think, part of our dive into Q&A in that question in particular. So we'll get to that here soon. We want to share a little bit more about the perspective of the designated interpreter. So in a lot of the cases in the discussions around accommodations, we don't always wrap in the direct service provider in the dialogue. And I think it's important here to stop and consider the service provider, the designated interpreter, the human element that is brought into this piece. We think about it as a service, and sometimes we think about it as sort of a non-human addition, if you will. But in actuality, there's a lot of impact that extra human will bring, not only to the deaf medical student, but also to the medical staff surrounding that deaf medical student. So just looking at the top here, we have asserting values. So sometimes there's a potential resistance from medical schools regarding the need for specialized interpreters, including concern over cost. And I'm sure all of you can relate that this is not singular to interpreter accommodations, but cost is always a consideration. So we'll be addressing that a little bit more, and that might be something that in the Q&A that we can talk about some proactive ways to reducing costs. Permission for preparation and outreach. Conducting early outreach to the clerkship to familiarize with the best practice with learners with hearing loss and the role of an interpreter. Early access to rotation schedule and curriculum to prepare and enhance the interpreting process. So as interpreters who are digesting the information and finding the source to deliver it, it is very helpful, and I will include captioners in that as well. It's very helpful to have some idea of the material in the content. The difficulty here is we all know that medical curriculum is fast-paced, and in clerkships it changes constantly. So how are creative ways that we can provide this type of support to medical interpreters, but also handle the fact that there's going to be a lot of unknowns, and you're not going to be able to predict in every environment what materials are going to be discussed or what the didactic that day is even going to be about. And so a lot of that kind of goes back to the designated interpreter model. When we have consistency there, we're building a vocabulary list that is workable throughout all clerkships, as opposed to interpreters rotating in, which may not be as familiar or prepared for the unknowns in that type of situation. Unconventional staffing needs and coverage. So interpreters may not be able or willing to work early or extended nights, weekends, and on-call hours. So this can be very true when working in the traditional interpreting style model, where interpreters work from an hour basis. That's how they look at their schedule. That's how it's traditionally been managed. But that doesn't really parallel very well when we're talking about a medical student's schedule. So I think I heard it said one time that there can be no maximum of over 80 hours in a medical student's schedule. So 80 hours, when we're thinking about a service provider and 80 hours, there's a lot to unpack there. How are we going to do that in the way that interpreters approach their work? How are we going to make that a seamless process? So it's, when we're talking about the designated interpreter model, there's ways to enhance that and make that a little bit more seamless experience than worrying about that traditional hour-to-hour model, which can sometimes be very cumbersome and conflicting, really. We could go to the next one. So clinical access and credentialing. Hospital credentialing, such as immunizations, HIPAA, background checks, badging, door entry access, scrub access, is required in order to integrate the DI into the learner's healthcare team. This is very true and near to my heart because, well, first of all, a lot of the hospitals that we rotate at don't always process us the way this student or an employee would be processed. There's good and bad to that. So designated interpreters will be working with that professional, that student at all times, and they'll need access to the same areas. I can recall specific instances where hospitals didn't want to provide a badge or access on that level. And what ends up happening is sharing the badge back and forth just to go use the bathroom or do something like that, as simple as that. So people aren't always looking at the whole picture in the way that the student and the interpreter are having to actually navigate their clerkship. And that becomes really important to be able to understand the hands-on experience, the day-to-day experience, not just the theoretical experience, but what is it like walking in their shoes from day to day. So more time given to prep for that credentialing process, knowing that it's not going to be as easy and streamlined, working with those hospitals to ensure that that happens so that doesn't delay the students' access to those, to that clerkship or to their accommodations. Dr. Argenyi touched on this as well. Visibility in settings requiring mask, speech reading interpreters may be necessary in areas like the OR, patient isolation, and where clear mask may be substituted for traditional mask. I can't remember if when we wrote this case, I think this was pre-COVID and we did not have the number of, is that correct? And we didn't have the number of clear masks that we do have today. But when we originally wrote this, this was an extreme obstacle for us. It still remains an obstacle on some levels. Having access to the clear masks that are now available in the areas of the hospital, having, instead of having to carry them around, but also providing them to other staff. And still, as of today, we don't have an N95 clear mask. So that's something in the making. But when you're thinking about students working with patients who are in isolation or airborne diseases in the operating room, those N95s are going to be required. So some workable ways around that to still be able to provide access to the student. And lastly here, identifying learner needs. The DI needs to work with the learner to determine the best fit of single or multiple modalities, such as simultaneous CART and ASL interpretation, for each clinical setting to best provide communication access. So we call this dual accommodations in our community when we're talking about captioning and sign language interpreting services together. People might think, why would there be a need for both services at the same time? In particular, there can be some really dense specialties. I think internal medicine is a really great example of that, where there's a lot of dense content for a lengthy amount of time during patient rounds. And sometimes that can be very taxing on the deaf individual to watch sign language interpreting that whole time. There might be some delays where it feels like they're not able to participate in the same ways they would if they were able to get it verbatim through CART. The operating room is also another great place to use CART because if you're focused on the sterile zone area, it might be difficult to look over to the interpreter or be able to put your eyes in one specific place. So captioning will have it up on the wall and you'll have several sentences at a time, if you will, to be able to refer back and forth. And so that just gives a little bit more flexibility in there. And I'm sure we'll talk more about dual accommodations later on. And I think this is my last slide. So proximity to auditory information, difficulty in hearing relevant information, such as within the sterile zone, in the OR, and around medical equipment. There we're talking about the interpreter not necessarily being scrubbed in to the sterile zone during an operation and being just outside of that, which can sometimes then make it difficult for the interpreter to be able to do their job, to be able to hear and relay the information. So some of the accommodations around that could be Bluetooth and other types of equipment to enhance that experience for the interpreter to have a better outcome for the student as well. Access to auditory technology, the ability and willingness to support staff to use microphones or other technology to enhance access to auditory information. So similar to what I was just talking to about the operating room, bringing in different pieces of equipment to either amplify conversations that are happening. Perhaps we're even talking about telephones and amplification in that way. Protection of support staffs. So advocacy also includes safety of any support staff, including formal training on sterile zones, personal protection equipment, bloodborne infections, and exposure to radiation, among other topics. So again, that human element, the interpreter is going to be exposed to the same levels of hazards as the student. So we can't forget to provide them with some precautions as well for their safety.
All right, now transitioning to the perspective of the disability resource provider. So first, the approval of accommodations. So the conflicting feeling about decisions made by, a committee, especially those that are unfamiliar with clinical accommodations or the interactive process and reasonable accommodations. An individual, DRP being inexperienced with requirements of medical training. So lack of understanding regarding core competencies, essential requirements for the medical school curriculum, as well as the school's technical standards and how those interface with accommodations. And then financial management. This always comes up as, where does the bill go for this? So lack of understanding about how to, that should be say fund instead of fund accommodations in what is considered reasonable. They're also concerned about legal compliance, so concerned about rejecting an accommodation request and the legal implications of that, and how to frame success. So difficulty explaining how an individual with hearing loss could practice medicine, given little knowledge of physicians who are deaf or hard of hearing, and being familiar with kind of access in the health sciences and medicine. So being able to cite, success stories or how this is being done at other institutions. And so for starting the process, this is a time we'll take a moment, to kind of review initial impressions about the case and, how you would navigate it if Conrad was your student. So Alicia, if you monitor the Q&A, I'll keep an eye out for participants who want to raise their hand.
We have the first question that we had is from Kelly Canyo Martinez. And she says, I would be curious if waiving the experience would be an alteration to the technical standards or the accreditation standards of that medical program.
I'm curious if any of the participants we have today have ideas or responses to that question.
I see one person with their hand up. Emily, go ahead. You should have the ability to talk.
I think in regards to waiving the requirement, that's a concern of discrimination, because why are we going to say that this is a non-important or non-critical portion of the education for this one student, but for all other students that this is a requirement? So that discriminatory feature of that, I think, is really important.
Yeah, and from a DRP perspective, one thing we typically raise is, it not having the assumption that the student would prefer that something be waived, that they would like to learn to navigate this area, and have the opportunity to experience the same thing their other counterparts are.
From a medical student perspective and somebody who didn't really have any interest in surgery, I could say that this is an easy way to get out of something that's challenging, but at the same time, it ties into this idea of what do you mean by an undifferentiated graduate? The reality is that many of my classmates were already differentiated. For example, and my attending and teachers when I was in medical school. For example, one of my attendings when I was on the internal medicine rotation, we had a conversation about how she was very interested in going into surgery, but she actually doesn't have great hand-eye coordination. It's just naturally like that for her. So she ended up going away from surgery into internal medicine. And that's how many of us are. So this idea that we're all equally eligible to apply to every single residency upon graduation is not actually realistic, nor reflects what Conrad probably sees among his classmates. He probably had friends and classmates who already know that they're not going to pursue a specific program because maybe they're really interested in having a family and they want to go into surgery, but the 5 a.m. call time just doesn't make sense for them. Or, maybe they don't do well living in a rural area. They have to be in an urban center, so they're going to look for specialties that have more opportunities in an urban center and so on. There's so many reasons that people differentiate even in medical school.
Good point. Any other initial impressions or questions before we move on to the kind of next slide and inquiry?
I'm just curious from the participants, Emily, I think you make a really great point that it can be a bit discriminatory to look at it as waiving that clerkship. But what other types of downfalls could there be from waiving this experience? I'm just curious if anyone else has encountered that or any thoughts they might have around waiving a clerkship besides just discrimination.
All right, and I see we have a hand up. All right, Kelly, you should be able to unmute and respond.
Hi, everybody. The other point of view that just came up immediately, I'm assuming in this situation, Conrad is friends with most, if not all, of his cohort. And if they find out just in conversation that they that he is getting waived from this experience, one outs the student as a student with a disability, but two, there would be probably a little bit of not infighting, that's not the word I want to use, but some jealousy, like, oh, why was he able to get waived from this and I wasn't? I can just see that this could cause some interpersonal issues with his classmates.
Yeah, and I think that that's an excellent point, Kelly. I mean, both from the othering that we touched on earlier, but also, I think one of the things we hear as disability resource providers so often is this is a slippery slope. And the idea of, the implications, because students do talk and, they're going to have friends and what does this mean? And how are we navigating the equity piece of it? So I think that's an important piece of the conversation with both with the student and with the medical school, and understanding the optics. Awesome. All right, we will move on to our next slide. So for this, we're just looking for thoughts on kind of where you start, right? So what do you know? What do you need to know, to support Conrad or the medical school or the designated interpreter? And how and where might you find new information that can lead to enhanced access or ability to navigate this situation?
People start to reflect on this particular question, I always find this the catch-22, what do you know? Obviously, if we had that working knowledge, that fund of knowledge, we would have more answers. So it's hard to be able to reflect on what I don't know as of yet. But I'm also curious from people, if you were presented with this challenge and you didn't have a fund of knowledge, how might you approach that? What would be your starting point? And would you be able to recognize that you don't have that fund of knowledge and might need to reach out for other resources? So just wondering what your thoughts are about that.
I think one of the ways to think about this question is maybe you do know a lot of things, but the people at the medical school may not, and how would you identify how to convey that information to the medical school so they can understand what's going on?
Thoughts here? Anybody want to contribute to this discussion? So where might you find information if you've never been exposed to the deaf culture, if you've never worked with a deaf student? And I will say, by and large, many of the clients that I work with, it is their very first time that they've ever encountered a deaf and hard of hearing medical student. So it is completely brand new to them. It may be new to the student as well. And so what are the types, where might we look? We may not always have the same resources in the medical community in terms of having access to that. So perhaps we'd be looking more towards the deaf community, other places like that. Exactly.
Yes,
So
I see a couple comments in the chat. So I see Emily said, for navigating the situation, I would turn to the listserv to crowdsource with some other to crowdsource what others have done. And in terms of listservs, as Alicia mentioned, it could be something specifically, within the deaf and hard of hearing community. There's the Coalition for Disability Access and Health Sciences, which, is a great community for that. There's the AHEAD listserv, which I forgot to thank them profusely at the beginning for helping us, launch this series and supporting us in that. They have a wonderful listserv. So that's true. And then I see Kelly said she agrees with Emily, looking into the listserv and reaching out locally to interpreting agencies to help get some perspective on what to do. I love that, reaching out directly to interpreters and understanding even their staffing, what they have available, their experience and what they've done thus far. And then Emily added the National Association for the Deaf. Thank you. That's one of the resources we'll mention later. And Alicia is putting in the chat right now for everyone some of the resources that we'll mention later and the hyperlinks to their websites.
Alicia, I'm curious, what has your experience been when you've reached out to local interpreting agencies through the years?
In terms of looking for resources for medical students?
Or residents and any level of trainees?
I think with one of the complexities most interpreter agencies are designed to handle K through 12 and higher ed. And I'm not even including medical school in higher ed in that component. And so again, we're talking about the hourly model. And if we look at this as an hourly model, what we have is lack of continuity. So an interpreting agency might not be able to even start to wrap their mind around, access to the hospital being a really important barrier to overcome to create seamlessness for the medical student, scheduling to create continuity so that we have exposure and repetition to build that vocabulary and also understand the learner's need for their language preferences and their style in the environment. That's not something, again, that human element. So it's not something you can intuit the moment you step into a room. I think as we can all experience, when you step into any room with other individuals, there's a moment, a dynamic that you have to understand how to communicate with each other. And that same process happens with interpreters and the deaf individual. So I think those pieces can really be a challenging to a standard interpreting agency who maybe just be looking at this as their regular old, hour to hour. How can I just fill the need with warm bodies? The other part is we have to know the deaf learner very well. We can't assume that they need the same type of accommodations or the same interpreting style as any other deaf individual. So, for example, I believe Conrad fit this case where he speaks for himself and he reads lips very well. So we need to look at that as a whole big picture and how we want to provide an interpreter for that specific person. If we have a deaf individual who can speak for themselves and prefers to lip read on occasion, how do we integrate an interpreter in that process without being intrusive in their process? So the regular training for an interpreter might be you step into an environment, there's the deaf individual, I'm going to interpret everything all the time. And with some individuals, they would prefer to pick and choose how they want to integrate the interpreter. And so that's a conversation that has to happen. That's a familiarity that happens through continuity, not through hour by hour.
Yeah, my experience has been that this is often a place that the medical schools or programs have started with because this is new. They need information. That's the first place to get any idea of what the cost or the availability looks like. And very quickly, or not so quickly, sometimes they kind of learn that doesn't actually work that well for what we do. And getting people from that, okay, this is what information we have, and this looks like it's the cheaper option that we have to cover the needs that we have, and we're going to try it this way too. This may actually be what really makes sense and what is actually leading to a fully inclusive, equitable experience. It's hard. It's hard to get people to kind of understand what the experience really is for Conrad and why he might succeed with what looks like good accommodation, but not really have the full experience that his peers do because of those little subtleties that Alicia just described. And, Grace, maybe you have some insight into how that conversation goes and what you might do to navigate that.
Yeah, it's actually a perfect segue. Thanks, Dr. Argenyi. So I was going to say that's why lines of communication, both with the student, from the DRP to the student and with the DRP to the medical school are really important. You have to build that trust, in both ways, because you want the student, sharing as much as possible about what has worked in the past, and actively communicating throughout the experience, because it is something where you're constantly tweaking. And because the nature of clinical rotations can be so different and the settings can be so different, this is a very, it's an ongoing process that is not, okay, we figured it out and the student's good to go, because you're going to run into new things and you're going to have to refine it. So I think also with the disability office communicating, depending on the model and the bandwidth, communicating needs that are happening there. So whether that's needing to create more bandwidth for a particular disability provider to be the point person for this student, because you want continuity with that DRP and the student as much as possible. I also think, obviously investing in things like the coalition's listserv or other resources is important, so they can, sometimes you learn, as the old adage of, building the airplane as you're flying it, which never sounds very safe, but sometimes that's the reality of the work that we do. So being able to communicate that with supervisors is important. And that's also about the financial piece of it, reminding them that what is most cost effective is not something that can be a primary consideration. It has to be, what is going to create the best, and most equitable access for that student. And that's important, I think, for the medical school too. And sometimes it gets a little, I would say, squidgy with who covers what financially, because medical schools quite often have their own kind of ecosystem occurring. But I think it's important to advocate, to the higher ups, because it's an institutional responsibility to fund those accommodations for that student. It's part of our compliance with the ADA. So if that is not something that was in the budget, but we want to make sure the student, has the access that they truly need, making sure we're communicating that higher up so that, however they find that pot of money, that those conversations go above the medical school, above the disability resource office, to remove some of those kind of sticking points in the conversation. And then last but certainly not least, you need that trust with the medical school, that they can be open about, well, we're concerned about this, and then knowing you'll work through it together, and that, it is going to be a process and you're going to be a resource. And it isn't like, hey, I determined this, now you figure it out. It seems like these are reasonable accommodations, go forth and figure out what that, implementation actually looks like. Because especially with a student who's deaf and hard of hearing in the clinical environment, a lot of the technology, they're going to have questions about, has this gone through the compliance office, especially if it has the ability to record. With some of our remote captioning, we, in CART, we had to talk about, is this saved? So is, somewhere in a cloud, or is this just real time? Therefore, it's HIPAA compliant. We had to review that with the compliance office at the hospital. So, it's important for there to be this transparency about all the work that's being done by the med school, by the disability resource office, and the student being involved in offering ongoing feedback.
I think there's an interesting balance that you allude to, because at the same time, involving the student is absolutely critical to the process. And I think my perception as a student and trainee in the faculty is that the DRP ideally should be kind of in the role of protecting that student, because every single question that the medical school or a clinician or supervising attending may have about those accommodations, it's often phrased in a way that is well-intentioned, but frankly a microaggression, and doesn't take Conrad's experience at face value. So I think there's that interesting dynamic as well.
All right, and then we'll start with the first question. And so for this, the question is, what are the benefits of Conrad completing a standard surgical rotation similar to his peers? And we touched on this a little bit earlier, but we'd love to hear a little bit more from you, the attendees, and how you as the DRP would frame this to the medical school who might just be trying to waive it rather than kind of go through the logistics piece of it.
any comments or thoughts regarding question 1? I know we did talk about it a little bit here, but maybe thinking about how you've had this experience in the past, or how this might impact Conrad in other ways, rather than him not only not having the opportunity and exposure to explore surgery like his peers, but how it could impact him later on in his career.
Awesome. I see Emily, you have your hand up. You should be able to unmute.
Yeah, to build on what Alicia said, I mean, just because Conrad might not have been interested in surgery or thought he wasn't interested in surgery when he started his first year, second year of medical school, he might get into it and realize that he never knew that he loved cutting people open and fixing them from the inside. So to take that opportunity away is doing a disservice to the trainee.
I think you bring up a great point, and what may coincide with that is maybe he finds out that he enjoys it, but and at the same time, maybe he also has this internalized ableism and autism, or all of this messaging from the school has made him think that, well, there's no way that it can be done well anyway, so why bother? And if it ends up being an achievable and accessible experience for him, that may also coincide with him discovering that it's the most fun thing ever.
Just to add to that, I don't know how many of you have actually experienced that, but I have seen students do a complete 180 where they thought that they would hate surgery and ended up completely falling in love with it. But also, I think that for some reason, when we talk about accommodations, surgery always seems to be the focal point. We find ways, okay, we can do that in family medicine, we can do this and this and this, but we end up putting all of our energy a lot of times in the surgery rotation. And what's funny about that is the surgery rotation, because of the nature of how they work as a team, they're actually a very well fine-tuned team, and they communicate well together. They all have their own jobs. And so bringing people in with a disability or an interpreter as the extra person in the room, actually, they're very welcoming and very able to integrate into the environment. And another piece I wanted to say before we read some of the chats that have just come up is, again, that thought of surgery being a silo experience. In actuality, the experiences that you learn from surgery rotation are also applicable to many other medical specialties. So internal medicine doctors sometimes have to perform bedside procedures. We have family medicine people providing procedures. We have OBGYN, which has a surgical component. So if you take surgical rotation out, you might also not be giving the best support to a student for other rotations. It has a domino effect there. So I think we have to think about it in broader terms than just surgery. And to read a couple of the chats. So it's just, a lot of people are having the conversation here, just reiterating the pieces about surgery, how it can really impact the future pieces. And not to mention the shelf exam. Emily brought that up. That's a really great point. If you don't have the hands-on experience during surgery, how might that impact you during a shelf exam? Other thoughts from participants?
Yeah, and I was looking at some of the comments from Kelly and talking about, even if that's not going to be your area of expertise or specialty, you need to be able to intelligently talk about that, whether that's because in another rotation like OBGYN, you'll be in some of these similar environments, or if you're in primary care or family medicine, and you're referring a patient for surgery, obviously, they're going to ask questions. What is it going to be like? What can I expect even before they get to the surgery team? So I think that's really important, reinforcing the baseline knowledge. And even beyond like the shelf exams for the step exams, that's going to be huge in having that hands-on experience and walking, intellectually through that case and preparing for those sections.
No other comments or questions. We can probably move on to the next question.
Yeah. And I saw there was another comment from Kelly about that, feeling that that's why it might be a fundamental alteration to the curriculum. And again, I think that's where we get into the idea of undifferentiated and differentiated programs and, what it says in your technical standards and programmatically, depending on what it says, that very much could be a fundamental alteration and not be an equitable experience for the student. So thank you, Kelly, for that. All right, so in question 2, how would you review or assess the technical standards to determine a reasonable accommodation for Conrad? Nobody wants to talk about technical standards?
Okay, Emily, we have a taker. Emily has something to say. Let's see.
Let me unmute her. All right, Emily, you should have the ability to chat or talk.
Well, I would start by going over the technical standards with the student and finding out where they would anticipate having a barrier. And then also going through all of the requirements of the different rotations and how they interact with those technical standards. But I think what we've talked about over and over again is going to the student. They're the expert in their own disability, and they're the only one that can really tell you whether they're going to or whether they anticipate experiencing a barrier in any particular portion of the rotations, and then examining that versus the technical standards.
Thank you. And I see Sarah also has a hand up. You should have the ability to talk now.
Yeah, thank you. I think the other piece to this that comes up for me is thinking about, obviously how the standards relate to the student and their abilities, but also then maybe re-examining if the standard or the technical standards require very specific, like, I'm thinking even beyond a deaf or hard of hearing student, but, if it requires specific technical skills and suturing or something, and that, making sure that it's not so specific and written in a way that is immediately uninclusive. So I think there also this kind of, when you have a student who comes against challenges, can allow you to kind of explore how, accessible are the standards, or are they too technical in nature?
I really appreciate that comment. I haven't kept up on it, but I know that several years ago now, there was a study looking at the technical standards across different schools, and many of them are still, I forget the term they used, but it was essentially process-centered, i.e. you had to be able to speak and hear well enough to communicate with the team, rather than being outcome-focused. What is the scale or the need that we actually want to be able to measure for those students to be able to be successful?
Yeah, and I think, I'm really glad that you said that as well, Sarah, because that's so important, that if we're looking at the technical standards and helping the student navigate them and help the student understand how they can be used as like a roadmap to understand maybe what to ask for, or to ask for more clarification on, and, so that they can determine reasonable accommodations. First, assessing, are they good technical standards, or is there work to be done in the inclusivity of how it's phrased, and how well defined, the requirements are in those standards. And again, that's something I think listservs can be really helpful with in comparing, especially if you're looking in an area outside of medicine. I feel like, there's enough people talking about it in medicine. We have a lot more resources and publications on technical standards and what inclusive standards look like. But there's also the difference between kind of compliance standards that aren't inherently using language that are saying you must be able to see or to walk or something like that. And, you know, kind of the social justice lens on the standards, and kind of creating some welcoming language and encouraging students to disclose and connect with a disability office and supporting students in that way.
And I just added to the chat the technical standards research that Dr. Argenyi was speaking of. He's actually very modest because he was an author of this particular conversation and research. So if anybody would like to look at that a little bit further, it was a very well-written article that came out a few years ago. And I wanted to add just to the comment that Emily had, and I think it is so important to remember to bring the student into the conversation in terms of their disability, their preference, accommodations. Something though that we have to be careful in that process, I think, is to remember that they're learners and this is their first time coming into an environment like this. So I think it's really important to empower the person with disability, the deaf and hard of hearing person, to be part of the dialogue in their accommodations, but not always necessarily will they have the answers right off. They may need to go through a trial and error process. They may need to see what works and be given tools and suggestions. That's where we go into the resource planning process. If we don't have anything to offer them, they may also not know where to approach this. They may not know if they want to work with sign language interpreters or captioners, or just use clear mask or amplified stethoscopes. There's a whole bevy of resources. And I think putting as much on the shelf as possible, plenty of tools for them to reach to, is part of that process, is part of that experimental process. And we have to keep that dialogue open and experimenting with that process as well, and not expect them to know, this is the answer, this is what I want. And we've actually seen that in some landmark cases where schools ask the student, what will you need for your accommodations? Student says, I'll need an FM transmitter amplifier. You know, they think, they don't know because they've never done medical school and they've never done clerkships. And then when they go to ask for additional accommodations, the school shuts that down for them because, well, they only asked for an FM transmitter. But again, engaging in that open dialogue and process is really important as they start to explore what medical school and what medical school looks like and what challenges they might have as they get into their clerkship. So that's a really important piece, I think, to always be considering in that process.
And Alicia, I think that ties back to the last question too, about, you know, the whole idea of waiving, you know, the surgery rotation or aspects of the rotation. You know, the more we avoid rather than kind of enter into these areas and try out different technology we have available in different ways, like the harder it is for us to make advancements in this area. Because the reality is, you know, and we hear this a lot or see this a lot in terms of when we're talking about fundamental alterations or unreasonable accommodations in the health science area, you know, escaping me right now, but one of the landmark cases, you know, where they found in favor of the institution, but they also said, but this could change. Like, you have to be working with the most up-to-date information. Technology is changing what's possible and what's reasonable every day. And so the more we're in these spaces and working through these pieces and innovating, we're creating enhanced access and more information to guide the next, you know, group of students, you know, in this situation.
I think also along that point is there's a question of, are we actually asking the right question, or do we have the right expectation? This is medical school. This is not us necessarily evaluating Conrad's ability to become a surgeon by the end of medical school. Most of the time, the expectation in the surgical rotation is to watch and hold the retractor for an indeterminable number of hours. It's not to do all of these other really fancy technical skills. It's to learn what they look like. It's to learn some of the anatomy. Maybe it's the case that Conrad, for whatever reason, might not be able to do some of those things at a resident, fellow, or attending level. But that doesn't mean that we should be thinking about those things. And I think it's a valid consideration to have everybody take a step back and say, are we remembering at what level that this is actually occurring?
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent and important point, you know, especially when it comes to medical school programs. It differs depending on the health science program, because they do look at, you know, how many other opportunities within that individual's, you know, career and education they will have to demonstrate mastery in, you know, particular areas. And because they are a learner, you know, when they're with us in a medical school, you know, experience, you know, sometimes they'll have fourth year, or it might even be residency. You know, they have all these other opportunities to demonstrate mastery and fitness for the profession. So, you know, that's why for medical school, sometimes certain things can be demonstrated in simulation clinics. If you have a sim clinic available to you, you know, if it can't be done actually in the space, but it's also a great way to test out what might actually work in like an OR space. Go to the sim clinic with the student, work through those pieces, you know, and kind of take it for a dry run. And I also wanted to comment and thank Emily. The two types of technical standards are organic technical standards, meaning that the very specific how you would complete it, saying like you have to be able to see or walk or lift. And then there's the functional, which is the ability to complete and meet that standard regardless of the how. It basically allows the accommodation to bridge that gap and to create access for that student. So thank you, Emily. All right, you ready to move to our next question? I think so. All right. So for this one, you know, thinking about how might an accommodation need change for a different student who is deaf and hard of hearing. So thinking about, you know, maybe a student who doesn't know ASL, maybe a student who relies on both receptive or input and expressive output ASL, i.e. does not use spoken English, or a student who develops headaches after viewing the CART transcript for several hours. Oh, I see Kelly raised her hand. All right, Kelly, you should be able to talk.
Hi again. Yeah, I happen to be working with a few hard of hearing students at my institution, and they both happen to have, or the few that I'm thinking of have different needs. One does use American Sign Language to communicate, and one does not. And I just so happen to be working with Alicia's company to help these students get the accommodations that they need. But one accommodation that for a student who may not know American Sign Language, they could use an oral transliterator if they're using, if they really more heavily rely on lip reading. They can have the oral transliterator come with them to the clinic experience and be able to read their lips, or even that person could have the captions on what I like to coin the iPad necklace and watch the captions and read lips at the same time to make sure they get full access to the space that they are encountering. And the other thing too to think about is there might be some needs in the didactic setting that would be completely different than the clinical setting. The didactic setting might just be, you know, CART interpreters or sign language interpreters, or it can be both, depending on what that didactic setting looks like. Yes, it's true. I think we should really rely on the student to help us understand what their disability is and what they need in that sense. But we, as the disability resource professional, should know and understand what is all at their disposal, and be creative to figure out what's going to be the best solution to make sure it meets everybody's needs.
comment from Emily here. Depending on the type and the severity of hearing loss, a pocket talker may be helpful, especially if a student does not know ASL. So again, I think as Kelly said, researching and knowing all the possibilities, I mean, they are extensive now in terms of possibilities. So we certainly wouldn't know everything, but I think when you think of an idea or have a notion of creativity, if you go and research it, you're almost always going to find an answer. I mean, I'm always amazed when I put in Google, can I do this, blah, 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 or does this exist? And Google always seems to have some kind of answer for me or some piece of equipment. So I think doing that research and being proactive in that way is really helpful. That would be good, Emily, if you could put the pocket talker, and there are a couple other, put it in the link there to share. There are a couple other resources in that similar to the pocket talker. I wonder if anybody else has had any experience using those and what the drawbacks of using something like that. So Kelly made mention, and I love how you coined that, Kelly, the iPad necklace. I hadn't heard that one before, so that's perfect. The pros and cons of having a piece of technology like that attached or strapped to you. What are the pieces that we have to think around that? Wi-Fi accessibility, battery being charged constantly, its effectiveness in a hospital environment where we have background noise, so impeding noises where it's not going to be able to pick up the conversation very well to translate it. So those are some things that I think we have to be careful not to just rely on one piece of technology, but have multiple pieces of equipment for different situations.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the Wi-Fi piece. That is huge for a lot of the technology used by deaf and hard of hearing students. And I think we just live in this environment where we're like, if it's a hospital or an institution, they'll 100% be great Wi-Fi. And that's the other piece. It has to be strong Wi-Fi. You don't want the interruptions. But there are some hospital systems, because of additional security measures and stuff like that, there's additional steps you have to go through to get that student Wi-Fi access, or it might not be great Wi-Fi. That was something I ran into with one of the students I was working with, that we had to avoid a couple of hospital sites for that student just because they were working on some of the Wi-Fi issues, and we just didn't want that to be a further complication for them.
That's fascinating. And I think that also kind of highlights one of the things that a DLP can do right now. Conrad is somebody who's a pretty vocal advocate for himself. But I know that I have had classmates in college who have hearing loss or other disability, and they don't know necessarily about these things. They just kind of said, well, I got by and made things work for me. So having the ability, your ability to come in and to an entire medical school class, for example, to say these are the things we can do if you find yourself struggling. Putting people who do self-identify, putting them in touch with mentors. So Conrad went ahead and did that for himself, but a DRP is somebody who can also do that, help facilitate, mentor, to help navigate what some of these look like, and to help empower students to figure out, well, do I want to go through the work of implementing these accommodations? How am I going to get over the strangeness of saying that my interpreter, if they've never worked with one before? Those things are difficult. How am I going to put a microphone on a surgeon for me to hear better if they don't have that? If they've never really done that before on a regular basis, and this is new for the student and with the learner as well. Those are challenging for them. And so you have a really, really important position and facilitating this empowerment and showing other students who may not have even disclosed what the possibilities are.
Yeah, and with that, it's always my plug too. If you can develop a kind of assistive tech lab, especially for deaf and hard of hearing students, so they can try out different things rather than, whether they're personal devices they'll use in, the future, having something they can try out before they purchase something they will continue to use is huge. I mean, a lot of these things are very expensive and there's not always, funding available for it. So as either a disability resource provider advocating for this as part of your AT lab or as a medical school. So everything from different types of stethoscopes, because again, it can be very, very particular to the student, even students that, all might have cochlear implants, how it interfaces with their implants or their hearing aids might work differently. So giving them things they can demo in these spaces, whether it's in the sim clinic or the actual clinical environment is helpful. So for instance, I had one student that really liked like the Rogers pens, but I had another one that found them difficult and cumbersome to use and far preferred some of the mic systems they had, or we found a mic system that can attach to an iPhone or an iPad, and so it could do live transcription, or it provided better audio, so their remote captioner could caption it. And that mic adaptation, I think, for their iPad was like $60. It was a low cost but high impact option for that student. So I think if you can have some of those things to kind of demo and try, that's important. Before moving on, I also wanted. Oh, go ahead, Dr. Argenyi.
No, sorry, I was just gonna say those examples really highlight that learners have different comfort levels of what exactly they might want to do. Conrad is somebody who has expressed that he really wants a high level of inclusivity and access, and some of your learners may be okay navigating using a microphone attached to an iPhone, and that's all they want.
Yeah, very much differs. And so I wanted to touch on C before we moved on to the next one. The idea, what if a student develops headaches after viewing the CART transcription for hours? Again, you want to explore different technology, different options for the student, but it could also be different settings for different rotations. So for instance, if your student's placed at the VA and it's, especially if it's a clerkship that has longer hours, all the surgeries tend to be scheduled there. Quite often they're already seated. Like there's things you can do to kind of plan out the student's day, and they can maybe identify, which they're going to be a part of. And it might be important to think about other accommodations like breaks and listening fatigue, especially for those hard of hearing students, and building in some of those other pieces because they might need those breaks so they don't, develop a headache that makes it difficult for them to continue on in that day. Perfect. So this is our last question before we have some housekeeping and then open it up hopefully for just some general questions. But how might the structure of your institution's processes, policies, and available resources help or hinder you in navigating a similar case? So now we're asking you to think about what we've talked about with Conrad and think about if this was your student, what would the process have looked like? What would have been the barriers, or what would have actually been kind of a support or resource you could have tapped into?
I'm gonna have to start calling on participants. Just kidding.
Yeah, cold calling. Yeah, so I mean, I can share from my perspective. I've been very fortunate at the David Geffen School of Medicine. One thing we looked at was the lack of specificity in our technical standards. So we're looking at updating that and thinking about the language that we're using. But in the meantime, too, we're looking at, our available resources. So my position on March 1st will have been there for a year. They recognized that a lack of a specialized DRP was creating more lag time for students, which again, as we've talked about in med school curriculum, like time is something that is of the essence and cannot be afforded to be lost. So having someone, you know, with a reduced course load and with kind of background and expertise in health science access, you know, was an important resource they wanted to add. And so, you know, I had experiences both with many health science programs, but specifically with a couple different medical schools. So that was an advantage, or is an advantage for us right now. But we also realized, like I talked about with the tech, that is something that would have been really helpful if we already had that all on hand when I started. So we're starting to develop kind of a collection of things that we can have students try out, you know, see if it works. If not, turn it back to us, and then connecting them. There are some internal resources for personal devices if they find something they like. There's some scholarship opportunities up to $1,000, you know, that they can tap into. So I would think in it, by adding my position, it helped us navigate a lot of these things for a student like Conrad and do it in a much more responsive way and in a time efficient way. But before I was there, you know, we saw many of the things that was happening with Conrad's case, you know, a lack of specialized knowledge, you know, an individual who had, you know, a high caseload and didn't necessarily know what the medical school curriculum or pace was like, and maybe not as much knowledge on working with a student who's deaf or hard of hearing in these really unique, nuanced spaces.
And in Conrad's case, he's going to the Technical Standards Committee, and I'm sure many schools, that committee is only going to meet periodically. So it does not necessarily reflect the adaptive process for a student who's going through a rotation every 4 to 6 weeks, if not faster.
Yeah, and anytime it's something by committee too, we're removing some of the important buffers that we need from an equity and compliance perspective. You know, that's why having a disability resource provider, whether it's, you know, someone who's internal to the program or just identified within the disability service office on the main campus, is important, because you need to have that trust, that connection, and, you know, the ability to kind of go between the students, you know, professional organizations and the school. And so, you know, the ability to kind of remove the need to have the technical standards committee meet directly with the student, or, you know, instead meet with somebody who can tell them, trust me, I've done my research, you know, here's the process I've gone through in the interactive process to determine that, or to determine our options. But, you know, that is not an avenue we can explore. I can understand why you're bringing it up. It comes up a lot with funding, and what's reasonable, you know, from an administrative or financial perspective. So one of the things I always remind individuals when I'm having that conversation from a program perspective, that the number of cases that can cite a financial burden are like none, you know, that we, you know, it's not just the disability office funding, it's just not the budget for the med school. You know, we're part of a UC system. It's looking at all the UC schools. And I'm like, oh, by the way, we're also part of Pac-12 currently, and we have all that funding coming in, you know, from our sports revenue. So our ability to say we cannot afford an interpreter, you know, at, you know, however many hundreds of thousands of dollars we'll spend over the course of that student's medical school career, is still a drop in the bucket compared to, you know, all the other revenue we have coming in. And so having someone that they trust and they're like, okay, they've spent the time, we've invested in this person, can really help in navigating that process as well, and reducing some of the back and forth.
I'm curious if either of you have ever had pushback. Well, if we start with one, more of them are going to come, and that's going to be expensive.
I would say it'd be interesting to hear if other people have heard that as well. I think as we were looking at some of the revisions that we're doing to our technical standards and discussing the more social justice approach to really disability, you know, and access in general forward language, the question is, you know, if we build this, are we prepared and structured in a way for them to come? And the reality is, if a student has a really good experience, that's going to be the word of mouth. That's going to cause other students to go to your institution anyways. And the reality is too, the number of students that go to medical school every year, the percentage of that, you know, those that have, you know, that are in the deaf and hard of hearing category, we're still not talking about like 50 students coming in at once. So that's why, you know, we say the reality of that occurring in a rapid influx kind of way is really just, you know, something that is worst case scenario, and I don't want to say worst case, but it would be a highly unusual event. And again, that's why the ability to advocate and say, if it does, as an institution, we're all supposed to support this student, so we can always advocate upwards for the additional funding, because we're doing our job well. We're being inclusive, we're meeting our diversity and inclusion, goals and vision. So this is a positive thing. I see Kelly has her hand up. All right, you should have the ability to talk, Kelly.
Hi again. What you were just talking about, Grace, is something that's similar that's happening at my institution. We had one student who needed these types of services, and then all of a sudden I had multiple. It just so happened that year that we had multiple students with who are deaf and hard of hearing and needed captioning or interpreting services. But I think what's nice about that is that if we have the one and we are able, like just say the first student, and we're able to execute those accommodations well and set up an estimate, so never going to be a guarantee of what the finances are going to be. You already set the precedent for what we are going to be able to do going forward. It's kind of sets up a nice, at least like, okay, this is what we did for this student. Obviously your needs might be different than what this student was before, but here are some options that we've used in the past that are successful. Let's talk about if these ones might be successful for you, or other options that we can explore also. Luckily, my institution has been very receptive to working with our students who are hard of hearing and deaf. So it's been an easy, to answer the question, it's been easy to navigate a similar case like Conrad's, but I just really wanted to emphasize that once you have the one and you understand the process and start it, it makes it just exponentially easier when more and more deaf and hard of hearing students come to your school.
Yeah, and some things too, like for schools that if they're using a lot of CART providers that end up just hiring them on as part of their disability resource office, like there's some cost savings and mechanisms that will be created that will actually make it an easier, more streamlined process. Awesome. So I know we're short on time. I appreciate everyone that's been contributing. We did want to share, we do have some resources that we'll make sure we'll get sent out to you either through the invite or as a follow-up for registration. These are about some landmark cases, some articles, and some, like I said, landmark cases. A reminder that the book club website, if you go there and are interested in participating in the future book club sessions, there's a registration there. There's some discussion questions that'll be posted ahead of time, and typically the facilitator names will be listed. If you're interested in purchasing the book, I will say Dr. Meeks and Dr. Boylan always say to check out to see if your library has it first, so that you can access it at no charge. But if you do want to purchase it, we will also have a link so that you could buy a copy of the case study book. And then we have a number of resources, again, that we'll make sure to send out to you. Some webinars by the AAMC. There's a great UCSF faculty training video that covers like Disability 101, privacy, common accommodations, that can actually be used in your internal training processes. We did that at UCLA. There's the Docs With Disabilities podcast. So Dr. Argenyi talked about, the importance of being able to find mentors and kind of a community. There's some great interviews with providers that have a variety of disabilities, but deaf and hard of hearing included. There's the Docs With Disabilities Initiative website, which is part of why we're here today, as it kind of kickstarted this book club. We'd like to give a nod to the Coalition for Disability Access and Health Science Education, definitely a major contributor and supporter of the work that we're doing. The Association on Higher Education and Disability, or AHED, a huge thank you, especially to Richard today, for helping us with this webinar. Additionally, if you want to gain more information about deaf and hard of hearing specifically, there is an association of medical professionals with hearing loss, or AMFL. The National Deaf Center is a phenomenal resource that I recently connected with that can do consultation for institutions, DRPs, and directly with students. And they actually have a lot more information coming along for health science specifically, so highly recommend checking them out. And then Dr. Argenyi recommended there's a UCSF surgery grand rounds regarding the deaf and hard of hearing perspective. So if you go to minute 31, second 24, you'll be able to, capture a specific point that focuses on this. All right, and that might be, we have 1 minute for questions, so I don't know. I'm happy to stay on, or you can find my information on the UCLA's David Geffen School of Medicine website. I'm happy to answer questions that way. Anything else? I want to say a huge thank you to Alicia and Dr. Argenyi for being here today and being a part of this.
Thank you, Grace, for joining our group discussion today. I really appreciate your expertise.
This has been fantastic, and I'm just really excited that we have so many people who care about this topic who also made it today.
Yeah, thank you. So I think with that, we're unfortunately out of time, and we apologize for the open question piece. But again, thank you so much for participating. And again, huge thank you to Dr. Meeks and the Docs With Disabilities Initiative and AHEAD for supporting and creating this opportunity. Thanks.